thank you all for being here. My name is Howard White, and with Janet Petrie right there, we are the chapter leaders of Citizen Climate Lobby here in Northfield. Citizens Climate Lobby is about 190,000 people strong worldwide. We have 150 or so of those people here in Northfield. Any of you who sort of think you're part of CCL Northfield, raise your hand, would you? And how many aren't sure that, but you still get my emails? Very good. Well, it's good to have you here. We are at Citizens Climate Lobby. We are volunteer lobbyists. We aren't paid. Basically, we have a very small staff in the organization, but we've got 190,000 people plus who work very hard on this. I would like to add our thanks to Environmental Carl's Organized Eco Group. It's a student environmental organization, and they arranged for this venue. Also arranged for our tech support, which I'm one who would desperately need it, and so it's wonderful. And oh, more Eco-Carl. Thank you, Janet. And so, and I think I would recognize her, but I don't think I see President Byerly in the room, do I? Have I missed her? We invited her just in case she could come and to greet all of you as the audience. This event is a precursor, if you will, early in the week to Northfield's Earth Day celebration, coming this weekend, especially Saturday, some event on Friday night as well. And so we invite you to participate in that. We are an official sponsor of that event, and hope you can attend some of the activities. Janet Petrie and I, a few years ago, over on the campus of Gustavus Adolphus College, we got to hear Dr. Lee Frelich speak to the lecture series that was going on at that time in the fall. I want to say it was the Nobel lectures over there, but I'm not sure about that completely. But Dr. Frelich is the director of the University of Minnesota Center for Forest Ecology. He's authored 200 publications with 275 co-authors from 25 countries. His research has been featured in the news media 500 times, including the New York Times, Newsweek, and the Washington Post. And his current research interests include large-scale fire and wind, we know a lot about that, earthworm invasion, and climate change in temperate and boreal forest. As part of what we enabled you to link to was this brochure from the Center for Forest Ecology. And one of the things I noticed on the first page of it, the center's mission is to provide science for stewardship and sustainability of forests. And with that, please welcome Dr. Lee Frelich.
Okay, thank you everybody for showing up. I actually got to rehearse this talk earlier today with the American Association of University Women. So I told them they were the guinea pigs and they all gave me a thumbs up. So I guess I'll give you the same version. So, could climate change turn Minnesota into the new Kansas? And I'll bet you're guessing the answer might be yes. And it could be, and I'll tell you under what circumstances that would happen as we go through the presentation. Uh-oh. It won't advance. It's frozen. Yeah, it's frozen for reasons that I don't understand. Well, we could look at just the first slide for the entire presentation here. Boy, this is a new one. There's an infinite number of technical problems, so you can discover them for your entire career. It was working while you were walking in the room. Any questions yet?
Tell us about your childhood.
My childhood, when I was 5 years old, I knew how to grow 300 different species of plants. When I was 12, I had read The Vegetation of Wisconsin, which is one of the great classics in ecology, and decided I was going to get a PhD in forest ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and that's exactly what I did. Oh, there we go. Thank you. So, as you know, the climate has been warming, and this shows the temperatures, world mean temperatures from actual instrumental data from weather stations. So, 1880 is as far back as you can go and have enough weather stations around the world to get a global mean temperature, and you can see from 1880 up to 2020 there. It's been going up. It's kind of like the stock market. It's a little bumpy, but basically it's going up faster and faster as we get close to the right side there. It reverses a 5,000 year natural cooling trend. So you can imagine the tiny amount of cooling each century if it took 5,000 years to cool down by about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. So people often ask me, won't the natural cooling trend balance out climate change? Well, the 1.8 degrees we've had and another 3 or 4 degrees of warming we'll have during this century, it would take about 3,000 years to be balanced out by the natural cooling trend. So yes, it will balance it out. But by that time, they will be digging you up as a mummy from ancient sediments. So not on a relevant time scale. And here are two alternative futures for the world. On the left is a business as usual scenario in terms of emissions of carbon dioxide. And it shows this region of the world getting about 6 or 7 degrees Celsius warmer by the end of the century. I have to be careful with that. I always say the end of the semester, which is next week at the University of Minnesota, so that's what's on my mind. But end of the century, not end of the semester. By the end of the semester, we'll probably still be having snow, but anyway, 6 or 7 degrees Celsius warmer, whereas with the reduced emission scenario, if we should happen to follow the COP26 agreement, it might be like the map on the right, and it would only warm up 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, which is 3 or 4 degrees Fahrenheit in this part of the world. So those are pretty drastic differences. Minnesota is especially vulnerable to changing climate because we are, from the point of view of an ecologist, the most interesting place on the planet. We don't have oceans, we don't have mountains. Well, we do have mountains, but they're 1 billion years old and they're only 1,000 feet high. We don't have any real mountains. But what we do have is a climate that allows prairies and temperate deciduous forest, which is maple, oak, and basswood, like the big woods, which you have around town here, and the boreal biome in northeastern Minnesota. So we have 3 biomes coming together here. And that makes it an incredibly interesting place. It also means we're the edgiest state in the union because we have so many edges of biomes and edges of all the tree species ranges. There's one other place in the world that has this same confluence of grassland, temperate deciduous and conifer forest. Anybody want to take a guess where that is?
Someplace in Russia.
You're close. It's actually Kazakhstan, yeah, which is close to Russia. So if you follow the Ural Mountains from northern Russia down, they go into northern Kazakhstan, and it's right there that the same three biomes come together. So there's one other place that's as interesting as Minnesota, but it's really hard to travel there these days. So here's our Boreal Forest on the north shore of Lake Superior. Everything you see here is white spruce, balsam fir, and paper birch. And this is the deciduous, temperate deciduous, mostly sugar maple, American basswood, red oak, some white oak. And this is Cannon River Wilderness, which is actually a county park, I think. And then here is prairie. We originally had 22 million acres of prairie, and only 1% of that still remains in Minnesota. So those are our three biomes, and they are very much determined by climate, which one that you have. So if we zoom in now and look at climate projections for this region of the world, and this actually shows summer. It's kind of underneath the toolbar up there, but this shows June, July, and August mean temperature change between now and the end of the century. For a high emission, which is business as usual, and a low emission, which would be the reduced emissions by 80% by 2050. And this one actually is in Fahrenheit, because Don Wubbles and I used it in Washington, D.C., and they don't have Celsius in Washington, D.C. So we made a slide that has Fahrenheit on it. Don Wubbles is one of those people who won the Nobel Prize for I think it was the 5th IPCC report. And anyway, you can see for the high emission scenario, we're getting warmer in summer by 12 or 13 Fahrenheit. And that would make us about the same as a small town called Manhattan, Kansas, which is west of Kansas City. You might ask the question, can moose live in Manhattan, Kansas? And the answer is not yes, unless you give them a swimming pool filled with ice water. And then the low emission scenario, we would only warm up by 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit, and that would make this area like north central Iowa. So the best we can do now is Iowa, and we're trying to avoid being the new Kansas. And summer temperature is incredibly important to trees and where the prairie forest border lies, and whether you have boreal or temperate forest. That's why I'm showing you projections for summer temperature in the future. So here is balsam fir. It's one of our main boreal species. In the upper map, the red, the bright red, that's where it's very abundant. It's our favorite Christmas tree in this part of the world, and we expect that tree ranges would move north by about 300 miles for that business as usual CO2 emission scenario. So in the lower map there, you can see that means it would move right out of Minnesota. A little bit of it would remain in the high elevations in the Adirondack Mountains in New York. And very similar results for black spruce, white spruce, and paper birch. And so in northern Minnesota, we would take this set of species, black spruce, red pine, jack pine, balsam fir, let's see, paper birch, quaking aspen, and white spruce, and replace it with this set of species with that business as usual scenario: bur oak, elm, American basswood, red oak, red maple, and sugar maple. So yeah, it will make a difference in the tree species for sure, and it might even mean forests would turn into prairies. So let's look in more detail what determines the difference between a boreal forest and a temperate forest. So this is these are study sites from one of my former PhD students, Nick Fisichella, who got his PhD several years ago, and he's now the president of the Schulich Institute at Acadia National Park. He went there and started out as one of their employees, and a year later he was the president of the organization. If he had stayed here, he would probably be my advisor by now. And he recently hosted a visit by Deb Holland, who's the Secretary of the Interior, and Yo-Yo Ma, who gave a concert on the cello to celebrate Deb Holland's lecture about climate change. So you should try to get that one sometime for your group. Anyway, he visited all of these places, and they go in a gradient from very cool summers like Grand Marais, where it's almost all spruce and fir and only a tiny little bit of maple and oak, out to the edge of the prairie where it's almost all maple and oak and only a tiny bit of spruce and fir. And along that gradient, he measured the growth of saplings in the understory, which represent the next generation of the canopy of the forest. So he did balsam fir, white spruce, which are two boreal species, red maple, sugar maple, and red oak. And this is what he found. If you look on a summer temperature gradient of mean summer temperature from 63 degrees, which is Grand Marais, to 66 degrees, which is like southern Minnesota, that makes a difference in the growth rate of these tree species. So with the cool summers, fir and spruce outgrow maple. And oak isn't shown on this graph, but it's very similar to maple. If the summers are warmer, then the maple and oak can grow faster. All other conditions being equal soil and water availability and so on can grow faster than spruce and fir. So if you look at a place like Duluth from 1960 to 1990, it was in that cool summer zone. And fir and spruce could outgrow those temperate tree species. And right around now, it's right near the crossover. And in the future, not too distant future, if it continues to warm, the maples and the oaks will outgrow the boreal species and therefore replace them slowly over several decades. But if they grow faster, they will replace them, overtop them and replace them. So as the climate warms, the temperate species will grow better and better, and the boreal species will grow not as much because their physiological system is not adapted to warm summers. And here is a place in Newport State Park, which is actually in Wisconsin, and it happens to be near my family's summer cabin. And when I was there in 1979, it was all fir and spruce. You could not find a maple anywhere. And then I went back in 2016 to that same place and looked at on the right there's a maple tree. And it's growing at the same rate as the fir. So the little bit of warming that's already occurred has allowed maple trees and oak as well to invade the boreal forest, at least the southern edge of it. I thought about cutting that tree down, but they don't like people cutting down trees in state parks, and not only that, it wouldn't stop the process that allowed that maple tree to be there. We can't maintain a fake boreal forest forever. So across all those sites in upper Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, there's a pattern that Nick Fisichella found of oak and maple invading spruce and fir forests in the understory. And that book that I told you I read when I was 12 years old, Curtis, Vegetation in Wisconsin, he said at that point there was no evidence that temperate trees were invading boreal forests. So, and that was an authoritative view at that time, but that's no longer true. They are invading all across the region. Okay, so that's boreal versus temperate. How about forest versus prairie? Could be either a boreal forest or a temperate forest. But what makes the difference there. And another student, Nick Dons, who is now on the faculty of the University of Wisconsin-Superior, he did this research and discovered that it has to do with the water balance. So you'll see P minus PET there, that's precipitation minus potential evapotranspiration. In other words, how much water evaporates and is transpired by the vegetation. So if there's more evaporation and transpiration than precipitation, it's colored in brown in the map on the right. That means a negative water balance. If there's more precipitation than evaporation, it's the green or the blue. And that is a forest climate if there's a surplus of water. So we figured that out, and then we said, let's put that on a map. We divide the landscape up into pixels, which are 1 square kilometer for the whole region, and get the climate for each square kilometer, which you can download now from international databases that climatologists have created. And we'll map these parameters onto that, and then we'll project it ahead using a general circulation model to see what it would be like towards the end of the century. So just to summarize, mean summer temperature makes the difference from temperate forest to boreal, and climatic moisture index makes the difference between prairie and forest. And here's what happens when you put that on the map. So there's the current on the left. You see the blue is boreal forest, the minty green is mixed boreal and temperate, and the yellow is the broadleaf deciduous, that's the maple, oak, and basswood, and the brown is the prairie. And notice that it doesn't follow the historic prairie forest border that was there at the time of European settlement. I'll say more about that in a minute. It now matches the western boundary of the state, the boundary with the Dakotas. So it is different than it was at the time of European settlement. But let's look at a low emission scenario in the upper right. And you can see there's still some boreal in Minnesota. It's receding a little bit. The prairie comes in a little bit, but it's the same Minnesota. You would still recognize it. For the high emission scenario with the 13 degrees warmer summer, much more evaporation, it's a different story. So if you take Kansas, which is like that, and you turn it up and put it in western Minnesota there, that's the new Kansas. And I'm famous, or maybe infamous, for my quote in the Washington Post saying that we have a perfectly good Kansas already, and we don't need a second Kansas in Minnesota, which appeared in the first paragraph of an article on the front page of the Washington Post 2 years ago now. Boy, talk about getting feedback. I got emails from all over the world saying, yes, we agree, 1 Kansas is sufficient, we don't need 2. And then there was other feedback, like, what kind of an idiot are you, and things like that. So that's the difference. Those are our alternative futures. With the high emission scenario, we could be the new Kansas. We would still have some oak forest in the Arrowhead, and a little bit of oak forest down here in southeastern Minnesota, which would be on the north slopes of the big hills in the driftless area. If we look at the whole continent, we have current, mid-century, and late century. So in the current map up there, there's a heavy black line outlining what is now the Boreal Forest. It dips just a little bit into northern Minnesota. We have the very southern part of it. Let me blow that up. So the heavy black line outlines the Boreal Forest. But if you look where the grassland arrow is pointing there, that whole brown area from Minnesota all the way up to Edmonton, that would switch from Boreal Forest to grassland, and almost all the way up to Cape Churchill. And then the other arrow pointing to that yellow area, that whole yellow area would change from boreal forest to temperate forest. Each of those is 3 times the size of Minnesota. So 3 times the size of Minnesota, boreal forest would die and become grassland, and 3 times the size of Minnesota, boreal forest would become maple and oak forest. So that's a huge change. So what does it look like if you do a climate analog? In other words, if we find a place that today has a climate like the climate of the boundary waters might be by the end of the century. And there is such a place, Granite Falls, Minnesota, the Orange Star. And they happen to have, not unexpectedly, rocks there that are very similar to the boundary waters. So you can look at an area that has the same chemistry of the soil and the same physiography, the only difference being the mean summer temperature. So here's the boundary waters, black spruce mostly here, on 2.8 billion year old remnant. And then if you go to the next picture, this is gneiss outcrops natural area. Gneiss is a type of rock, and it's a very nice rock. It's this very nice in this picture. It's actually a metamorphosed granite. It's 3.6 billion years old. It's one of the 4 oldest rock outcrops in the world. But it's very similar physiographically to the boundary waters, and look what you have. Oak trees and patches of prairie in between. So the only difference between these 2 pictures, no difference in the soil, the physiography, the amount of water. Basically, it's the 8 degrees summer, 8 degrees Fahrenheit summer temperature difference that causes more evaporation and will not allow a contiguous forest. So going back to the historic and the current prairie forest border, on the left is the historic, which was found by the land surveyors in the time of European settlement, late 1800s basically. And it's not in the same place. And people often point that out to me. They say, well, you say the warming climate will change the forest into grassland, but it's moving the other way. And that's true, it is moving the other way. But there's nothing to stop it from going one way and then halting and reversing and going back, right? So we knew it was going the other way, and our model showed that, and we were really happy that it worked. And the reason for that is that the climate along the prairie forest border is wetter during the summer than it used to be. So this whole blue area on this map has gotten wetter in the last 30 or 40 years. So most of our warming has been in the winter, but there's not much evaporation in the winter. Summers have gotten wetter, but not a lot hotter, so there's more water and the same amount of evaporation. So what did I tell you earlier? If you have a positive water balance, you'll get forest, and we now have a positive water balance all the way out to the Dakotas, and the entire state of Iowa is a forest climate now. So if you're managing a prairie and you're fighting really hard to keep trees out, I'm not surprised at all, because we now have a forest climate everywhere in Minnesota. However, as we move into the future, if the summers get to be 8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, there will be so much more evaporation that the prairie forest border will move back the other direction. And do that, the edge of the brown and the yellow there would be the prairie forest border. You can see this actually if you look in Kansas today, like Kansas City and Manhattan, Kansas, believe it or not, have 40 inches average annual rainfall. That's more than the Twin Cities. It's a little bit more than here, but yet they have prairie, because the summers are so hot that that water all evaporates. If you want to find a place that's as warm as were projected to be in Minnesota at the end of the century that has forest, go to Fayetteville, Arkansas. They have 47 inches of rain per year, and they have a summer 8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, and they have sugar maple trees. So we would need 47 inches of rain per year to maintain forest with the temperatures projected for the business as usual scenario, and they're only projecting like 36 to 38 inches, and that just won't do. So increasing temperatures and higher evaporation could outstrip the increase in precipitation, leading to a rainier but drier climate. And this is something I've struggled to explain to climate scientists. They just think if it rains more, it's a wetter climate. But if you ask a tree, the tree will tell you if there's more evaporation than rainfall, it's a dry climate regardless of how much rain falls. And the tree will tell you that by making a narrower ring when you interview the tree. If you take a core and look at the rings, you can figure that out. So a rainier but drier climate, if we have 38 inches average rainfall, but it's as hot as Kansas, all that extra rain will evaporate. And we could be the new Kansas. So there are tipping points in the world, and the IPCC report, as well as these papers in this paper in Nature Geoscience, show these tipping points, one of which is the Boreal Forest, the southern margin of the Boreal Forest in North America, which goes from Minnesota to Edmonton. And by the way, Edmonton's also right at the edge of the Prairie and Forest. On the north side of the metro area, you have forest, and the south side, you have prairie. Anybody know how much annual rainfall they get there? No? 8 inches. And it's such a cold climate, there's so little evaporation, 8 inches can support a forest. But you get on the south side of town, 7 inches of annual rainfall, that's not enough to balance the evaporation, and you get prairie. And if you go to Brazil, you can get 60 inches of rain and have a savanna, because it will all evaporate. So the Amazon, right at the 60-inch rainfall line, that's where it goes from savanna into rainforest in the Amazon. So it's all about the matching of the amount of evaporation and the amount of rainfall. Of course, it's summer all year in the Amazon. And it's only summer for 2 months by our standards in Edmonton. So other things will happen as the climate warms. We'll have droughts. We'll have insect infestations. Insects do better in warmer climates. Trees under drought stress can't defend themselves against insects. We'll have more windstorms, more fires, and so on. So there'll be lots of other factors other than just the climate itself to push the prairie, if it's going to advance into Minnesota, to push it right along even faster than from climate alone. Then we have these weird dips in the jet stream. We've been in one since the week after Christmas, where there's been a big dip in the jet stream, and Minnesota and about a third of Wisconsin and a third of the Dakotas have been in the polar vortex since Christmas. We're getting pretty darn tired of it at this point. We've had below average temperatures that whole time, but you can get the opposite pattern in the jet stream, like shown there, which we had in 2012, when the Twin Cities only had 2 days below zero in the entire winter, the average being about 30. And in March, we had magnolias in bloom on campus, and we had the entire spring break. It was in the 80s every day. Remember that? In 2012, 10 years ago, my students went to Florida for spring break, and it was only 60 there. And and it was 80 or 85 in the Twin Cities, and I would suspect it was that warm here as well. And that has a weird effect on the Boreal Forest. You can see there it went all the way up to Hudson's Bay almost. What happens when it gets to be 80 degrees in March in the Boreal Forest? The trees wake up. Boreal trees wake up as soon as it gets warm. They live in a place with very short growing seasons. They're in a hurry to start growing. And if they wake up in March, it's too early. They can't use a 6-month growing season. They only can use the 3-month growing season. That's what they're adapted to. So by May and June, we had massive browning of the spruce forest there near Thunder Bay, and this is actually one of our research plots in the boundary waters. In the upper picture, and those are balsam fir and jack pine trees that have turned brown by June. And they did recover because the next spring, 2013, 2014 were cold and wet. So they recovered. But if we had 2 springs in a row like that, it would wipe out all the Boreal Forest from Minnesota all the way out to Labrador in one fell swoop. And guess what an average spring is projected to be like in the year 2090 for the business as usual scenario. Exactly the same as the spring of 2012. So it could be that this phenological disturbance where the timing of the trees waking up in the spring could end up being the thing that kills off the Boreal Forest. It won't kill off the oak forest because oak trees are conservative, right? They wait and wait and wait until you have many, many 80-degree days before they leaf out. So we've had big fires recently. We think fires should be more common in a warmer climate. We've seen that in California, Oregon, Washington, and now in Colorado. Remember the big fire they had that burned a city just before Christmas, when Colorado should normally be snow covered? Well, we have a return of big fires in Minnesota too. We have a 400-year history of fires in the boundary waters. And we know these big fires occurred from the late 1500s up until about 1900. Then there was hardly any fire for almost a century. And now since the year 2000, the big fires have returned. And the question is this return an early sign of a changing climate? So this chart shows fire cycles, which is the average return time. If you just look at the column on the far right. So before European settlement, it was about 122 years. So an average spot in the boundary waters burned every 122 years. In the settlement era, it was 87 years, because settlers, of course, have a tendency to start some fires. And then look at 1911 to 1972, 2,000 years it would take to burn an area equivalent to the boundary waters. That's a pretty low fire frequency. And that's because the climate got warm and wet, because we got more rain because of the warming of the climate without balancing it with evaporation. So there was excess rain and the fuels just didn't dry out as much. And now, looking at 2000 to 2021, we're back to a 100-year fire cycle again. And the question is that the first step going to much more frequent fires and fires like we have had in California, or is it just a return to what the normal was for hundreds of years prior to European settlement? And the answer is, I don't know. We're going to have to wait another 10 years and see. This sort of thing is inherently historical. You can never tell what it's doing at the time that you're looking at it. You can only tell by looking backwards. But my guess is we will start getting big fires like they have in California soon in Minnesota. If it continues to warm, someone produce a hazard of large fire in the future, a map of that, and Minnesota stands out as a huge red zone on that map. as an area that will probably experience a huge increase in very large fires in the near future. And I think we've started to see that, but I can't tell you for sure. So we've returned to the historic fire frequency from the 1700s to 1900. And if you invite me back in 10 years, I'll answer that question. So, and this is just to acknowledge the Park Service for funding and the Environmental Trust Fund. And of course, you know that comes from the lottery, right? And the Legislative Citizens Commission on Minnesota Resources distributes millions of dollars that to the university every year, and most of our graduate students get their support from that. So if you played the lottery and you lost, you didn't really lose because you supported the graduate students who did this research. And then some miscellaneous people there, Bruce and Ruth Dayton, Darby and Jerry Nelson, and other people who helped with the analyses. Bruce Dayton was our retired governor's father. I had the best lunch of my life with him at the Minneapolis Club. So he invited me to lunch, and he sat there and talked about a Monet painting he had just bought for the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. Talked about it for half an hour, and then he stopped and he said, "What did you want?" And I said, $500,000. And he says, "Oh, okay." And he goes back to talking about art, and the check arrives the next week. And he paid for lunch too. So there is free lunch. And that supported this research as well. So the funders and the graduate students who did all the work, that's all I do is tell everybody what to do. So it's nothing to that. It's everybody else who is important. So this image here is by David Luke. He's a photography professor at Normandale College in the Twin Cities. And he took pictures of the boundary waters and then digitally erased the part above the water and inserted a picture of an oak savanna. So you see the forest that exists there now reflected in the water. So this shows our alternative futures in one picture. He's actually got a whole bunch of these images. If you have a gallery space here, you ought to invite him to put it up on display for a couple of months. Incredibly interesting work that he did in order to envision potential change in Minnesota's forests. So I want to give him credit as well. And as you can see, this is the end. So if there's time for questions, I will answer them.
And there is time for questions. We have one in the streaming chat, and I'll let Janet speak to that.
Scott says, "I've had this question for a long time. Minnesota foresters usually say that mid-aged forests are best for sequestering carbon, while old growth forests store the most carbon. But Mumont and others, I could say Mumont et al., I suspect, Mumont et al. Say that the truth is that old growth is sequestering carbon the fastest. Who is correct?"
Bill Mumont is correct. He's one of the main authors of the IPCC. He's a really good ecologist. I think he lives in Massachusetts, so next time I'm out there, I'll try to visit him. Old growth forests sequester huge amounts of carbon. Those big trees can have as much carbon as many, many medium-sized trees. They also have dead wood on the forest floor, and in northern Minnesota, thick moss. So you can have incredible amounts of carbon in old growth forests. And in fact, I signed 2 different letters that had several hundred scientists signing them. One went to whoever the head of the European Union is, and the other one went to Joe Biden recently, urging them to protect old growth forests, in part because they sequester carbon.
All right, we have time for more questions. I'm going to bring the microphone around so that you can speak into it loudly for the hearing impaired. That's me.
Yes, my question is two-part. The first one is, I was up last week with some citizen climate lobby people up in Tedagooch State Park area. And while we were leaving, we were saying, well, we should keep in touch and maybe heck, we can find any glimmer of hope. So the question is, from where you sit with your knowledge of all this, what in the human realm that impacts all this is a glimmer of hope that you see? Now, just preface it with, last summer, I went to our cabin, which is in the Gallatin Forest in Montana, and it has imbalance with water like you've described, and the insects have killed a third of the trees, and I found that apocalyptic, so glimmers of hope would be welcome.
Okay, glimmers of hope. Boy, there's actually a lot of things I could choose from there. I guess I would pick the Trillium Tree Initiative, which was started by a teenage kid in Germany 10 years ago. Obviously, he's not a teenager anymore. And he has a website called Plant for the Planet. And so there's been an analysis done of the world using satellite images, and there's 2.2 billion acres on the planet that used to be forested that is not forested now. You know, and it meets the climate criteria that I specified here for potentially supporting forest, and is not needed for agriculture. And if we were to plant that, 2.2 billion acres is about the size of the 48 states, which is about 5% of the world's land area. So the question is, could we plant 1 trillion trees, and that would end up being a couple hundred trees per acre on all of that land? Well, actually, 100, something like that. If we were to plant 1 trillion trees, what would happen? The first decade, not much, but decades 2, 3, and 4, we would sequester a lot of carbon, take a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere. And that would only be somewhere around 100, 120 seedlings per person. So the question is, knowing all these pieces of land everywhere in the world that were identified that could support forest and don't have forest, could we plant 100 seedlings for every person on the planet in the next decade? And the answer is yes, we could. I don't know if we will, but we certainly could do that. Plant for the Planet has a website that you can go to. And there are sites all around the world. On the map, you can click on one. It will tell you all about it. You can choose to donate money to plant trees at that site. And so the one that the University of Minnesota has in there is called Green Again Madagascar. So one of our former graduate students got a master's in forest ecology and then moved to Madagascar several years ago and decided to reforest the rainforest on the east coast of Madagascar, which is about 89% has been destroyed. And so he started a nursery there and is growing 60-some species of native trees and establishing native forest plantations for local farmers who want to reforest their land. Because a lot of these trees bear fruit and it's like their dinner. They also grow rice, of course, but they want fruit and so on, habitat for wildlife. So that's a glimmer of hope. The COP26 would be if people would actually, if countries around the world would actually do what they agreed to, because they agreed to the same things from COP21 to COP25, they never did it. This time was an exception and they suddenly did it. That would be a glimmer of hope.
A couple other things. You could look up something called En-ROADS, EN-ROADS. It's a simulation developed out of Climate Interactive at MIT, and you can see how various strategies would impact the temperature. The other thing you can check out is something called Drawdown, DRAW-DOWN, and check that out for things that can be done. And the third thing that I would say, and my wife, that Janet, and I've been watching a Netflix documentary special with Barack Obama, and it's just tremendous about what's happening. It's called Our National Parks. It's not us in the United States, it's worldwide. So now I'll get back to the questions.
I don't know whether this is part of your field, but I've been so curious to wonder what we have wrought by cutting down the redwoods and what it has done to lack of transpiration to the continent.
Yeah, the redwood forest was not that big, so on a continent-wide scale, it doesn't have a big impact, but regionally, it has a huge impact, just like the Amazon. You know, if another 20% of the Amazon is deforested, the whole thing will become a savanna. It's 20% deforested now, and if it gets to 40%, the whole thing will become a savanna because a lot of the rain is recirculated water that's transpired through the trees. The same is true in the redwoods, that they just didn't have a big enough area to have a continent-wide impact like that. The Amazon would actually have a worldwide impact. It would affect the climate of the entire world, whereas redwoods occupied a tiny acreage relative to that. Did you know redwoods can actually take water in through their leaves from the fog? And some of the redwoods, and one Douglas fir that we know about, was close to the maximum height that any tree could have on the earth. There was actually a Douglas fir that was 207 or 300 or 407 feet tall, where the city of Vancouver, BC is right now. The theoretical tallest height a tree could ever have is 420 feet. So you couldn't pull a column of water higher than that, given the level of gravity on the earth. Now, if you planted a redwood tree on Mars, it could be 500 feet or 600 feet tall, if you could get the water to it there, because there's less gravity.
There was a question in the streaming chat. How do you stop the deer from eating the Trillium trees?
Well, you can put tubes on them. You can put little white papers on the growing tip so that they mainly eat that during the winter in Minnesota, because they eat herbaceous stuff in the summer. You give them alternative food. One of my graduate students actually studied this area right around Northfield, and this was back in the 1990s, one of my first graduate students. Discovered that woodlots that had alfalfa growing within 2 kilometers of them, which is like 1.8 miles or something like that, or 1.6 miles, didn't have the deer eating the trees or the trilliums or the orchids. They ate the alfalfa and they just used the forest for shelter. Ones that didn't have any alfalfa within walking distance for deer, they ate the tree seedlings and the trilliums, and those woods were in much poorer health. So make sure the deer have something to eat, or bring the deer population down. It's all about the equilibrium between their food source and the deer. And if their food source is your red oak seedlings, and you're trying to grow a red oak forest because red oak is their favorite thing in southern Minnesota, that can be kind of a disaster. For foresters, it actually is a disaster. You cannot regenerate red oak unless you build a fence around it.
Okay, I'm looking for the next hand. No.
Correct my thoughts on the process here, but it seems that planting trees is good. It takes about 40 years for them to be sufficiently capable of sequestering carbon. And when they die, the carbon comes back into the atmosphere. Is that correct? So is it a short-term solution to a long-term problem?
It can be quicker than that. It depends how fast the trees are growing, which depends on the species and the soil. And on deep, silty soils in southeastern Minnesota, you could be sequestering a lot of carbon by year 20. And that would continue for 6 or 7 decades. And when trees die, the carbon does eventually go back to the atmosphere. But if the tree dies In a windstorm or a forest fire, sometimes they don't rot for several decades. And I'm actually involved with a project with a company called Carbon Works to look at how fast dead wood decays. And basically, if you can get the bark to fall off a dead tree, it case hardens, which means it turns gray, and then it won't rot for decades. And so they're trying to, we're actually going to do some experiments where we girdle trees and kill them on purpose and see if we can get the dead wood to stay there for decades while growing a new forest underneath. And the Boundary Waters actually does this all the time with the big fires. The big fires char the outside of the tree. They actually only consume 5% of the carbon in the forest and turn it into CO2. So 95% is still there even after the most intense fires. And they're all charred and they will not decay for decades, and a new forest grows underneath. So nature is telling us through how forests respond to natural disturbances like fires and windstorms that we can store a lot more carbon on forests if we just don't want it to be so tidy and neat and have to clean up every piece of dead wood. You can store an awful lot of carbon in forests.
Next question, yes.
I was wondering how land use affects the kinds of changes you foresee for Minnesota. So if instead of working ground for farm purposes, millions of acres were used for something else, would that change the profile of climate migration of warming through the state?
Yeah, we could sequester a lot of carbon back into the soil because lands that are tilled annually have been giving off carbon for 100 years now. That could all go back in. And basically, if we were to take half of all cropland, turn it back to either prairie or forest, whatever is climatically appropriate, over several decades, we could sequester almost as much carbon as we've already emitted to the atmosphere. A lot of people don't realize that a huge proportion of our croplands are grown to feed animals. So if people switch to a plant-based diet, they don't need half of all the acreage of farms. And you can do other things with them that are equally as exciting as grazing cattle, like restoring natural vegetation. And that could be one of the main activities that humans do over the next several decades, is restore the planet. I mean, it's not any different than restoring an old house. You're just restoring the global house for everybody. And it's not that there wouldn't be anything for farmers to do. There would still be just as much for them to do, and they would be contributing an equal amount of value to society by doing those practices. Actually, I have a former graduate student who has a organic farm at near Cannon Falls. Is that right? Cannon Falls, it's called, not Cannon River Falls. Yeah, Cannon Falls. He has like a 5-acre farm. He grows 20 or 30 different crops every year, sells them to people in the Twin Cities, gives them a different vegetable every week all through the summer. And his take-home pay that he keeps after paying the mortgage and stuff is equal to a farmer who has thousands of acres of corn and might be able to get $500,000 for it, but 90% of that goes to pay the mortgage for $2 million worth of big equipment. And only keep $50,000 while he does all the work by hand, uses fertilizer that he recycles, and he keeps $50,000 off of his 5 acres. So yeah, it's a new way to do agriculture, which is actually an old way.
I have 3 questions here. I know we're running out of time, but he can hear me anyway. So there are two questions about managing your small forest for carbon. Mm-hmm. And so if you could say something about that.
Yeah, managing a small forest the more small forests are managed for carbon, and even little patches of forest in cities, the bigger the trees, the better. The messier the forest is better in terms of leaving natural disturbances alone and letting natural processes take place. So if you have a lot of weedy trees like box elder or something, you might have to introduce some long-lived trees that have dense wood that stores a lot of carbon. So there are some forests that are nothing but buckthorn and Chinese elm or Siberian elm. And in that type of a case, you would want to introduce red oak and basswood and sugar maple, which are trees that will get big and have dense wood and store a lot of carbon. And manage your deer so they don't wreck the place, because if they eat all the understory plants, you'll have soil erosion. Then the trees won't be able to grow and you won't sequester the carbon.
We have a question back here.
That farmer that you referenced earlier, what will their farm look like and their challenges that they'll face look like when they're farming in a climate that's like Kansas?
Yeah, they'll have to change to some different crops. But when you have small areas like that, you can tend the plants individually, and that gives you a bigger climatic latitude. So yeah, I mean, they'll definitely have to introduce some new crops and maybe have to drop some others, but there's a lot of different varieties of each crop that are adapted to different lengths of summers and different amounts of heat. You know, so like the corn they plant in central Illinois is not the same as what we plant in Minnesota, which is designed to mature on a short growing season compared to further south. So there are different varieties that you can use, and so those are adaptations you'd have to make.
Questions? Yes.
Yeah, what about silvopasture? I've been reading about that a lot, where you utilize the forest to shade the animals and provide some understory feeding, and you have to manage it closely and move the animals around, whether it's sheep or cattle. They don't need all that corn and soybeans that the factory farms have need of, and so you still get plenty of meat from the silvopasture. Also, when it comes to methane emissions, which are very serious, those big factory farms produce a tremendous amount of methane that goes into the air, whereas I read that animals that deposit their manure on the soil, it's a different kind of different kind of composting. The one is aerobic, and that's the factory farms, which sends the methane into the air, and the other is anaerobic, where the animal puts it right on the ground and it breaks down without the methane going into the air. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think it's quite a bit better than the typical farming that's done, and you're kind of mimicking what bison did on the landscape. Yeah, but it's kind of intermediate. It's not as good as if everybody ate vegetables, but it's halfway between that and factory farming. So it is better.
Well, first this Janet and then that Janet.
Okay.
So lots of questions in the chat, and quite a few of them are from landowners about how to manage. And one, there's a question about, should we be planting deep-rooted trees on our woodlands, and what specifically in Rice County would you suggest?
Yeah, rooting of trees actually depends on the soil structure. I mean, oaks can be a little bit more deeply rooted than other species of trees, but That's just as much because they grow in a certain soil type as anything else. It's actually the amount of oxygen the roots can get that's important. So if you have a clay soil, there are hardly any species that can put their roots deep in the soil because there's no oxygen, and roots need a little bit of oxygen for respiration. So it's more the soil structure that determines how deep the roots can grow. And so if you're planting basswood or red oak or white oak or sugar maple, the roots will go as deep as they can given the structure of your soil. Yeah, there are some trees with a taproot that sends a root down to tap water deep in the soil, but that's not the main root system of the tree. The main root system of the tree looks like a mattress, and it's basically between 1 and 2 feet thick and going, for a big tree, going 50 feet in every direction. Yeah, people always think of trees as going as far down as they do up, but it's not the case. It's more like a tree standing on a big mattress of roots.
Well, I'm going to give you this man asked for signs of glimmers of hope. And I'm going to speak as a grandmother. I'm totally disgusted with us baby boomers. We knew what we were doing, and we chose to be self-serving. We chose to go after greed. We've dropped the ball on just about any arena you can think of. But what I see in my grandchildren is they get it. I remember the first Earth Day in 1970. I was part of it. And then what happened? Next to nothing. My grandchildren, one of them, our granddaughter last week, was part of a program at her middle school in West St. Paul. It's an amazing school. And they have like aquariums, like look at that blackboard, maybe not that big, but those kids take care of them. They know their fish in ways I never dreamed, and they care about the earth, deeply care about the earth, and those kids understand the implications for their future.
Yeah.
We had the opportunity to know that, and we blew it off. So my glimmer of hope is that this next younger generation will be way smarter and less self-serving than we are.
Right, yeah. Well, I actually live in a 800 square foot condominium in downtown Minneapolis and do everything on foot. I did drive a car here. It's hard to do Northfield on foot from Minneapolis, but, and so I'm using like maybe 10% as much heat and air conditioning, and yeah, so I was an exception, but if some of my friends from the United States come and visit, it's like, how can you live in this little closet? When my friends from Europe come and visit, they walk in and it's like, whoa, do you ever have a huge apartment?
I'm going to interrupt the questions right now, but I'm going to get back to them as long as Dr. Frelich is willing to take them. But I wanted to do 3 advertisements. One, if you want to be on the CCL mailing list, there's a sheet on every table. Feel free to do that. Secondly, if you are a CCLer or just interested in and want a yard sign, and especially if you can hand me $10 to defray the cost, I'll be there in the back. And if you have any other questions about any of this or getting involved or actions you can take, I'll be near that location, near the exit. But I want to make sure people feel free to leave. They are not trapped here. But I sure, again, appreciate all of you being here. And Bruce, you have a question?
I have 1 acre of woods, and I've been told I should be very unhappy about discovering earthworms there in the last few years. Can you say something about earthworms?
Yeah, there are no native earthworms in Minnesota. And they eat the forest floor, which is a multi-year accumulation of leaf litter, and that they emit as CO2 to the atmosphere. It's not so serious in southern Minnesota as it is across the Boreal Forest, where there's a huge amount of carbon in the forest floor, and they are invading Lapland, and they're invading in Alaska and all across the Boreal Forest and emitting millions of tons of CO2 as a result. But you know, Darwin wrote a book about earthworms after he wrote Origin of the Species, published it in 1870 or 1881. It was the last thing he wrote about before he died, and he said basically that earthworms run the world. And today's scientists still think they have a bigger impact on the way the world is today than any other group of organisms, but they've had 500 million years to do it. Humans will probably get to that level of influence in just a few decades here. But yeah, earthworms change the ecosystem hugely. They compact the soil. They make it droughtier because the water won't soak in as fast. And they cause the nutrients to leach out. Nitrogen, phosphorus especially leaches out and goes in the water and causes eutrophication. So it's pretty much an environmental disaster for Minnesota. But in 1,000 years, our ecosystems will adapt to their presence. So ecosystems are resilient, but people are not patient enough to appreciate the way that ecosystems adapt to change, because it takes too long from the perspective of a life of a person. But they will learn, the native fauna in the soil will learn to compete with the earthworms. The trees will develop coarser roots that aren't disturbed and so on, and they will adapt over a period of several centuries, just like they did in Europe thousands of years ago, and that's where the worms come from. Question here.
It seems like there's more and more forest fires, grass fires, all kinds of fires. Do we need to be changing our tactics for fighting fires, or what's a good move?
Well, actually, in most coniferous forests and also brushy forests like the chaparral in the Mediterranean climate areas of California, where they have wet winters and dry summers, those are the two most flammable types of vegetation on the planet, including the Boreal Forest in northern Minnesota, and you actually cannot control fires at all. So fire is going to do its thing in conifer forests and in that chaparral type of vegetation. There's essentially nothing people can do about it, other than make sure that we can get people out of the way, maybe have defensible space around houses and so on, which is now required by the new codes in California, use fireproof building materials. But in other systems like oaks, savannas, and prairies, the fires actually help carbon to be sequestered. So it varies a lot among different vegetation types, but we're never going to control fires in a conifer forest like they have in California or northern Minnesota. Did you know that last summer, just north of the Canadian border, there was a fire in Ontario that was 450,000 acres. And it was only about 50 miles north of the border. And in Manitoba, there was a fire that was 700,000 acres. And there were 250 other fires in Ontario. And they burned a total of 6.5 million acres, and that was all the smoke we saw in July and August. We occasionally got some smoke from Oregon, but most of it came from just north of the border. And some of those fires are in the zone where they attack fires immediately when they begin, as soon as they're detected, and they still blew up to be 400,000 or 700,000 acres. And the Greenwood fire in Minnesota, which ended up burning 29,000 acres, there were several other fires that each only burned a few hundred acres. And so I talked with the district ranger in Ely, and I said, did you know which fire was going to get out of control no matter what you did? That the Greenwood fire would do that, and you didn't have to even visit the other fires because they would only get to be 1,000 acres and go out. And he said, yes, they knew that from their models. So they knew ahead of time the Greenwood fire would get out of control. They would not be able to do anything about it, and it would not stop until they had rain, and that's exactly what happened. So they have really good models that predict fire behavior these days. And I just taught a whole course about that this semester. The final exam is next week. So about fuel models and predicting fire behavior and its effects on forests, but we're not going to control fire in conifer forests. They are going to adjust to climate change via fire doing its thing, and we're just going to watch it happen.
I have another question from a woodland owner, but I'm going to say my 2 cents worth first, which is that when we talk about what gives us hope, it's you turning out, people doing something. I really like Catherine Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist, and I can't quote her whole book, so I'll just say 2 things. And one is the first thing she says you can do about climate change is talk about it, because most people don't. So talk about it to your friends, because they're worried too. And the second thing she says is join something. That doesn't have to be CCL. It could be your garden club that's working on something. Just work, join something and work on it. And now I'll get to woodland stuff, which is what do we do about our buckthorn and garlic mustard? Should we care? Whatever. So
well, yeah, you can remove buckthorn. The problem with removing buckthorn is there is nothing to replace it, and so it comes back. But we've done some research at the University of Minnesota showing that if you plant native plants, like native understory forest plants, they can compete with buckthorn. It's just that when you get rid of buckthorn, there's nothing left and there's no native plants there. And we do have native plants that will compete. Shrubs, herbs, even raspberries, blackberries, even white snakeroot, which only gets 2.5 feet tall, it can compete with buckthorn. But it has to be there to compete. And so reintroducing your native woodland plants is very important after you remove the buckthorn. Otherwise, the buckthorn will just come right back in, and that was a lot of work for nothing. White snakeroot can defend itself with its chemicals. Yeah, it can repel other plants. It's an incredible competitor. It killed Abraham Lincoln's mother.
Oh, yeah, that's right. And does it get rid of garlic mustard? Is that what the other
Yeah, garlic mustard, the same thing. Native plants have to be there to compete. Yeah, white snakeroot killed Abraham Lincoln's mother from what they called milk sickness. So they were living in Indiana, and the cows went out in the woods and grazed on white snakeroot, and the toxin doesn't kill the cows, but it gets in the milk and it kills people who drink the milk, and so she was diagnosed with milk sickness and died, and that's why the family moved to Illinois. So if white snakeroot wasn't so poisonous, this would not be the country that it is now, because Lincoln probably never would have been president. So, yeah.
What short of the need for land, what caused the big woods to disappear?
Well, it's mostly just conversion to agriculture. That's 98% of it. A little bit conversion to roads and cities and other things, but basically that was it. It was good quality soil. You could grow corn and soybeans on it, and it was removed for that. So I have a project now to look at the biodiversity of the remnants of the big woods. And the question is, are all the species present in the remnants, which represent a tiny percentage of the area, is that supporting all of the original species or not? We don't know. And we have the original species record in the herbarium at the University of Minnesota, which specimens go back to the 1850s. And they're all digitized now. You can search the herbarium on your computer. You don't have to go there and look at these stinky sheets with all the preservative and naphthalene and stuff that you breathe in. You can, and they're incredibly high definition. You can zoom in and look at the texture of the leaves and the seeds. So we're going to compile a master list and then see if all those species are still present in the remnants. So
I don't know how much more time you have. I want to thank you before I forget to thank you for all the time you've given already.
Well, it's up to you. I do have to drive back to Minneapolis, and that'll take a little bit of time.
So again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for being here.
Welcome.
And we'll see you again, I hope. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah.